There were 300 people in that ballroom when my husband lifted a microphone, smiled at the crowd, and turned me into the joke of the evening. "Let's open the bidding at $20, he said, like he was delivering the line everyone had been waiting for. "Who wants this useless wife?" The laughter came instantly. It rolled across the room in one ugly wave, as if all those people had only needed his permission to laugh at me. Somebody near the back even lifted a bidding paddle just to keep the humiliation going. I stood there in the blue dress I had bought specifically for that night, and I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene, I just looked at him. Then, from the far end of the room, a man's voice said, clear and calm, $2 million. And the whole room went dead silent. If I'm going to tell this story honestly, I have to start long before that moment, because I didn't end up on that little stage in front of everyone we knew overnight. It happened slowly, quietly. Over 27 years, one dismissal at a time, one small insult at a time. One erasure after another, until I had gotten so used to fading into the wallpaper that I almost failed to notice the night my invisibility became a public performance. I had spent the entire day preparing that gala, every centerpiece, every place card. Every last-minute call to the caterer, who still couldn't keep the final head count straight, no matter how many times I went over it with him. All of it had been my work. For 11 years, I had been the one holding those events together. Ever since Gregory's charitable foundation had grown beyond backyard dinners and into proper fundraising galas, I had been the one making sure every detail landed where it should. I never asked for recognition. At some point, I had convinced myself that was all right. Some people stand center stage. Some people keep the machinery running behind the curtain. I told myself I had accepted my role. Gregory showed up 40 minutes late, exactly the way he always did. He swept into the room with that polished, easy charm that made people turn toward him before he even spoke. He kissed my cheek in front of the board, told everyone I had somehow managed to pull it all together again, and then spent the next hour claiming credit for decisions I had made completely on my own. Right down to the wine list. Years ago, that would have bothered me. By then, it barely registered. People can adapt to almost anything if they do it long enough. The jokes began during dinner, after Gregory had enough of the expensive scotch he liked to keep within reach at these events. He told the people at our table that I was hopelessly outdated. Said I still balanced a checkbook by hand. Said I probably had never sent a text message longer than 4 words. Everyone laughed. I smiled, because smiling is what women like me get very good at, and passed the bread basket to Mrs. Alderman, who patted my hand with that strained little sympathy that somehow hurt worse than the joke. At one point, Gregory leaned back in his chair and said, loud enough for several nearby tables to hear, "She's the least exciting woman in this room." Then he added, "And I say that with love." He always tacked that on at the end. With love, as if that phrase could cancel out everything that came before it, as if cruelty became acceptable when wrapped in marital humor. I'm not even sure who first suggested the auction idea. It may have been Tom, Gregory's business partner. Tom loved those silly charity bits where men auction off dates and women bid for some harmless evening out with the local eligible bachelor. All playful, all supposedly charming, all for the cause. Someone joked that it would be funny to do the same thing with married couples. Gregory, naturally, thought it was hysterical. I remember dessert had barely been cleared when he grabbed my hand and tugged me out of my chair. There was a small stage set up for the band. For half a second, before I understood what he was doing, I thought perhaps he wanted to make a toast, or thank the donors, or maybe, foolishly, briefly, say something kind. Instead, he borrowed the microphone from the bandleader, placed his free hand on my shoulder like I was some item being presented for inspection, and said the sentence that finally shattered 27 years of pretending not to notice. "Let's start at $20. The room laughed the way rooms do when there's wine on every table, and everyone trusts the man holding the microphone to define what is funny. I looked out at 300 people I had fed, hosted, written thank you notes to, remembered anniversaries for, arranged seating charts around. And every one of them was laughing at the spectacle of me. Sold for $20, reduced to a prop, a punchline, I did not storm off the stage. I did not throw my drink in Gregory's face, though there was a part of me, a small, exhausted, furious part, that wanted to. I just stood there, shoulders back, hands loosely clasped, and let the laughter spend itself. Because I had learned long ago that dignity is the only thing in a room like that you can still keep if you refuse to surrender it. Someone in the back shouted, 20, more laughter. And then all at once the tone in the room changed. $2 million, not loud, not dramatic, just certain, every head turned. Gregory's hand slipped off my shoulder, so fast it was almost as if he'd been burned. I looked toward the entrance and saw him. A tall man in a gray suit I had never seen before, standing near the back of the ballroom as if he had been there all along. He was watching me, not with amusement, not with pity, but with something I couldn't immediately name. Respect, maybe, or recognition. Whatever it was, it made my pulse jump. Gregory gave a brittle laugh and muttered something about an incredibly generous donor, but by then nobody was paying attention to him. The man had already started walking toward the stage. Slowly. Calmly, as though the entire room would make space for him, and it did. For reasons I couldn't explain, my heart began to pound, not out of fear, out of instinct. The strange sensation that something irreversible had just entered the room. He stopped a few feet from the stage and looked at me as though I were someone he had spent years trying to find. Up close, I could see he was older than I'd first thought. Around 60, perhaps, gray at the temples, composed in the kind of way that made everyone else seem restless and loud. He did not glance at Gregory once, only at me. "My name is Daniel Whitmore," he said. The reaction around the ballroom was immediate, a little intake of breath from several people at once. Clearly, the name meant something significant to nearly everyone there. Everyone except me. "I hope you'll forgive the interruption," he said. Gregory recovered before I did. He stepped forward with his hand out, and that practiced public smile switched back on. "Daniel Whitmore, of course, we're honored. We had no idea you'd be joining us tonight. Your generosity toward the foundation is—" "I didn't come for your foundation," Daniel said. His tone didn't rise. He didn't need it to. Something in it made Gregory's hand drop before it was ever taken. "I came because I heard your wife would be here." There are silences so complete they almost make noise. That was one of them. Somewhere across the room I could hear ice clink in a glass. Gregory laughed again, thinner now, and looked at me as if he expected me to explain a reality I was only just discovering myself. "Angela. Have you met Mr. Whitmore before? Do you know him?" "No," I said. It was the truth. I had never seen the man before in my life. And in 27 years, I had never once given Gregory reason to doubt my word. I certainly wasn't about to start then, in front of everyone. Daniel turned back to me, and something in his expression softened. "Mrs. Simmons, I know this must seem strange. I promise it's not what it appears to be." He glanced briefly at the microphone still hanging loosely in Gregory's hand, then returned his attention to me. "Would you allow me to take you to dinner tomorrow evening? There's something I need to tell you, and it doesn't belong in a room like this." I should have refused. Everything habit had taught me said to smooth it over, protect Gregory, reduce the awkwardness, pretend the whole thing had landed harmlessly. But when I looked at Daniel Whitmore, I saw something I hadn't been offered in years. Not indulgence, not condescension. Not the tired, faintly patronizing fondness Gregory wore when he wanted to appear kind. I saw plain, unapologetic respect. "All right," I said. "Tomorrow evening." The whispering began before we even made it back to our table. "Who is he? Does she know him? Did you hear that number?" And I realized, with a kind of detached disbelief, that after 11 years of orchestrating Gregory's galas, I had somehow become the most talked about thing to happen at one. Not in any way he would have chosen. He didn't question me until we were in the car, the valet ticket still crumpled in his pocket. "Do you know him?" His voice was controlled in the particular way men sound when they are trying very hard not to reveal how rattled they are. "No, Gregory. I told you inside. I've never met him. $2 million, Angela, for a joke. That's insane. People don't do that. So where did you meet him? Grocery store, pharmacy. Somewhere. I have no idea who he is. That was true. But already part of me had begun turning the night over in my mind, searching for the hidden seam that would explain it. He went quiet after that. The kind of silence that isn't acceptance, only suspicion with no proof yet attached. When we got home, he went straight into his study instead of coming upstairs. I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, hearing again that calm voice from the back of the room. $2 million. I knew it. I knew I had never heard it before. And still, I could not shake the feeling that my life had shifted. What I didn't know was that Gregory had already phoned Margaret, his executive assistant, before we were even halfway home. He told her to learn everything she could about Daniel Whitmore by morning: business history, former marriages, public records. Most of all, any possible connection between Daniel Whitmore and Angela Simmons. And what Margaret would eventually hand Gregory, the next day, would frighten him far more than evidence of an affair ever could. Because what she found was proof that Daniel Whitmore had been quietly searching for a woman named Angela Simmons for years. Daniel chose a restaurant tucked away on a quiet side street, the kind of place Gregory and I never went because it wasn't fashionable enough to impress anyone. The tables were spaced wide enough apart for privacy. The lighting was soft. The room had none of the performative glamour of the places Gregory preferred. Daniel stood when I arrived. He pulled out my chair before the host could. That small courtesy nearly undid me more than the dramatic bid had. After we ordered, he sat looking at me for a long moment without speaking, as if he were gathering himself before a conversation he had imagined many times. I owe you an apology for last night, he said finally. I know it must have seemed theatrical. That wasn't what I intended. But I had been trying to find you for a very long time, and when I saw what your husband was doing, I couldn't sit there and let it continue. You still haven't told me how you know me, he nodded. You don't know me, but if I tell you the story, I think you may remember someone else. He drew a slow breath. 30 years ago, you were teaching elementary school. Do you remember a rainy afternoon in the fall, downtown, near the bus station? A teenage girl was crying outside under the awning. Something inside me shifted. Not a memory exactly. More like the beginning of one. There was a girl, I said slowly. Maybe 15, maybe 16. It was pouring. She was soaked through. I almost kept walking. And then more came back. I could see her clearly. Thin coat, shoulders hunched, flinching when cars slowed nearby. I bought her dinner, I said, at a little diner. I remember that. Her name was Rachel, Daniel said, and for the first time his voice faltered. Rachel Whitmore, she was my younger sister. I put down my fork. The restaurant seemed to recede around us. She had run away from our stepfather's house. It wasn't safe there. I was already an adult, living across the country. I didn't understand how bad things were until much later, almost too late. He looked down briefly, then back at me. Rachel told me that night she had planned to get on the next bus and disappear. She didn't care where it was going. She just wanted out. Then a stranger came over in the rain and asked if she was hungry. The memory opened all at once. I remembered staying with her long after I should have gone home. I remembered calling a woman I knew at County Social Services rather than trusting the general hotline. I remembered sitting in one of those awful molded plastic chairs until nearly 2 in the morning, refusing to leave until someone competent and kind came to take her somewhere safe. I visited her afterward, I said quietly. At the group home, a few times, I brought books, I checked on school, we exchanged letters for a while. I looked down at my hands. Then I got married. We moved, life happened, I lost touch. I've thought about her over the years. I always wondered what became of her. Daniel's face changed then, grief and pride living side by side. She became a lawyer, foster care advocacy, emergency housing, legal services for kids aging out of the system. She built an entire national organization. She used to say it all started with a diner meal and a woman who had no reason to stop, but did. He reached into his jacket and set an envelope on the table between us. She died 8 months ago, he said. Cancer. The words settled between us. Near the end, she asked one thing of me. She said, find the woman from the bus station. Tell her she saved my life. I hadn't cried on that stage, not while they laughed, not while Gregory priced me at $20, not on the drive home. But there, in that quiet restaurant, over a girl I had nearly forgot, and a kindness I had never counted as important, I cried. Softly, helplessly, Daniel let me. The $2 million wasn't a donation, he said after a while. Not to your husband's foundation, and not a stunt. Though I'll admit I wasn't upset that it exposed him, he leaned forward slightly. I did it because I suspect people have been assigning your value for a very long time, without bothering to see you clearly. I wanted, if only for one moment, a room full of people to understand what you were actually worth. I pressed the napkin to my eyes. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything tonight. He slid the envelope toward me. This is from Rachel. She wrote it before she died in case I found you. I never opened it. It wasn't mine to read. I took it with both hands. Even unopened, it felt heavy. And somewhere inside me, I knew that whatever Rachel had left in that envelope was going to alter my life in ways I could not yet imagine. I read her letter alone in the guest room. By then I had started sleeping there because I couldn't bear to open something so sacred, while Gregory paced the hallway demanding, over and over, to know what Daniel Whitmore really was to me. Rachel's handwriting was neat and careful, precise in the way some lawyers write when every word matters. It began, Dear Angela, if you're reading this, my brother found you at last, and I pray it wasn't too late. I want you to know that the woman who bought me dinner on the worst night of my life became the reason I spent the rest of it believing strangers could still choose kindness. Everything I built traces back to that hour. You may not even remember it clearly, but I lived because of it. I have left instructions for my attorneys. What I'm giving you is not payment. You never asked for anything. It is simply proof that kindness does not vanish. It multiplies. Sometimes it just takes years to find its way back. Attached to the letter were legal documents that I had to read twice before they made sense. Rachel had not merely left me money, she had left me a role. A seat on the board of the foundation she had built. A controlling voice in its future direction. Authority over real resources, over scholarships, legal aid, shelters, emergency funds. Over a mission that had already changed thousands of lives, and now, somehow, had been placed partly in my hands. I sat at the edge of the bed for a very long time, staring at papers that made my own life feel suddenly unfamiliar. Downstairs, Gregory was busy constructing a different story. By Wednesday, he had hired a private investigator, a man named Foster who specialized in marital cases. Gregory had convinced himself that Daniel and I must have had some secret history. An affair, perhaps, some hidden relationship dramatic enough to explain a $2 million bid and a private dinner. Foster found nothing of the sort. What he uncovered disturbed Gregory more. He found former colleagues from my teaching years, who remembered I kept granola bars in my desk for children who arrived hungry. He found Diane, a widow I had visited every Tuesday for 2 years after her husband died. Those vanished afternoons Gregory had never once asked about. He found grown former foster kids, who still remembered I had shown up at school concerts, because no one else would. He found Harold, a veteran who said I had helped him push through the maze of paperwork that finally got him the benefits he'd nearly given up on. There was no scandal in any of it. No affair. No betrayal. No double life. Just decades of small acts of care I had never thought worth mentioning, and Gregory had never thought to ask about. Then the video hit the internet. I never found out who filmed it. Probably just another guest holding up a phone, recording without thinking. But by Thursday, the clip of Gregory grinning into that microphone, "Let's start the bidding at $20, had been viewed 4 million times. The captions were savage. The comments were worse. A late-night host mocked it in his monologue. A women's advocacy page reposted it with the caption, "This is what everyday cruelty looks like when it puts on a tuxedo." That post alone crossed 1 million views before Friday morning. Sponsors started calling. two luxury developers Gregory's firm had been working with suddenly wanted their attorneys to review exit provisions. A reporter from a regional business publication requested comment from me directly. I declined. I had no prepared statement, and I had no intention of improvising one. By Friday evening, Gregory looked like a man who had aged half a decade in less than a week. He sat at the kitchen island with his phone face down in front of him and said quietly, "It's everywhere, Angela. I can't stop it." I didn't answer immediately. I was thinking about Rachel's letter upstairs, about a frightened girl in a diner booth, about how differently Gregory's life might have unfolded if in 27 years he had ever once asked what I did with my time when I wasn't organizing his world. Before I could respond, his phone rang. He answered, listened, and I watched the color leave his face. "The board wants an emergency meeting," he said. Monday morning. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. Gregory came home and told me about it in fragments, as if his mind still could not fully arrange the humiliation into language. 7 directors sat around the conference table in the glass office he once loved showing off to clients. According to Gregory, none of them would quite meet his eyes. It was Bill Ashford, the oldest member of the board, who finally said what everyone else was thinking. "This is not about a bad joke, Gregory. Bad jokes get forgiven. This is about what the joke revealed, that when you believe no one important is watching, this is how you treat another human being." By that afternoon, 2 developers officially backed out. A hotel group withdrew from a pending deal, citing concerns about brand alignment in the bloodless wording lawyers prefer when reputational damage has become too expensive to ignore. By midweek, Gregory stopped mentioning numbers altogether. Then, on Thursday, he came home with an invitation from a morning television show. They wanted both of us on air. Gregory had already agreed. All he needed from me, he said, was to sit beside him, smile, and tell the audience it had all been harmless. Just a joke. We were fine. I wasn't hurt. I looked at him for a long moment. "I won't lie for anyone anymore, Gregory, not even you." He didn't argue. I think by then he no longer truly expected me to say yes. He simply sat down at the kitchen table, put his face in his hands, and for the first time in years, I felt something almost like pity. Not enough to change my answer. Just enough to remind me that ruin, even when deserved, is still ruin. Later that week, I called Daniel. Not about Gregory, not about the interview, about Rachel's letter. About the position she had left me. About the strange and frightening sense that life had handed me a purpose I didn't yet know how to carry. He did not pressure me. He didn't tell me what I should do. He simply said, "Take your time. The foundation will still be there. But if you want, I can show you one of the shelters." Sometimes seeing the work makes the decision clearer. I said yes before I had fully thought it through. The shelter was smaller than I expected, a converted apartment building on the edge of town. There were bright curtains in the windows, obviously chosen by someone who believed beauty still mattered, even in temporary places. Daniel introduced me to the director, a weary, warm woman named Priya. She walked me through the building, explaining who stayed there, how long they could remain, what supplies were always short. That's where I met Lena Brooks. She was sitting in the courtyard on a bench, maybe 28, with a little boy asleep on her shoulder and a slightly older girl coloring beside her. Her face held the exact kind of exhaustion I recognized at once, not the kind that comes from lack of sleep, but the kind that comes from pouring every bit of yourself into keeping your children safe, while pretending everything is still under control. She looked up at me with that guarded expression people get when life has taught them not to expect good things from strangers, and something in her face struck me so hard it nearly took my breath. For one suspended second, I was looking at a girl under a bus station awning 30 years earlier. I sat beside her. I did not start by asking what had happened. I asked whether the children had eaten. When she said, "Not since breakfast," I went to the corner store myself, bought sandwiches and juice boxes, and sat with them while they ate. I waited the way I once had with Rachel, quietly, without pressing, letting her decide what to tell me and when. When Lena finally spoke, the story came in pieces. A husband who drank. A shelter in another town with no room, 2 months in a car, someone finally directing her to Priya's building. I listened without interrupting, without rushing her toward a version of the story that would be easier to hear. By the time I left that afternoon, the foundation had agreed to cover 6 months of Lena's rent, while she completed a certification course she had already tried twice to finish, and twice been forced to abandon. It was not a grand gesture by the standards of the organization Rachel had built, but driving home, I felt something I had not felt in years, maybe decades, not admired. Not useful because I was convenient, actually useful, not a decoration at someone else's table, not an extension of someone else's name. Useful. Gregory noticed the shift before I spoke about it. He saw it in the way I stopped arranging my life around his schedule, in the way I no longer looked for his approval before deciding where my time belonged, in the way I came home from foundation meetings awake, alive, carrying energy instead of depletion. One evening he watched me set down my bag after a late meeting and said, almost as if thinking aloud, "You don't need any of this anymore, do you?" He meant him. The company, the house. The old identity. I didn't answer right away because I was still discovering the answer myself, but looking at him under the kitchen lights, I realized he already knew. The invitation to Rachel's foundation gala arrived in a cream envelope, with my name embossed in gold. Under it, one line made me read the card 3 times to be certain I was seeing it correctly. Keynote speaker, Angela Simmons. I called Daniel immediately, convinced it had to be an error. "It's no mistake," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "The board voted unanimously. They want the founder's story told by the woman who unknowingly began it." I nearly refused. Speaking in front of a crowd had never been my world. I had spent my entire life doing the work from the edges of rooms, never the center. But then I thought of Lena, 6 months into her course now, sending me pictures of her daughter's schoolwork like someone slowly relearning joy. I thought of Rachel's letter folded carefully in my dresser drawer. Kindness doesn't disappear, it just takes a while to come back around, so I said yes. The night of the gala, I dressed by myself in the apartment I had moved into 6 weeks after telling Gregory I needed space. I chose a deep green dress. Nothing at all like the blue one from the night everything changed. I did my own hair. I checked my reflection once. I did not look at my phone for approval from anyone. And when I walked into that ballroom of 300 people, I was not arriving on the arm of a husband ready to use a microphone as a weapon. I was walking toward a stage where my own name had already been printed in the program. Daniel met me near the entrance, offered me his arm, and escorted me in the steady way old friends do when they know your nerves are louder than your face shows. "You don't need to perform," he told me, "just tell the truth." That's all Rachel ever wanted from anyone. When they called my name, I walked to the stage without shaking, though my heartbeat was so loud I thought it might be audible. I looked out at the audience, donors, staff, board members, former residents from shelters we now supported across 4 states, and began with a rainy afternoon outside a bus station. I told them about the girl under the awning, about the diner, about how close I had come to walking past because I was tired and had papers to grade. I told them I had not considered what I did that night extraordinary. That I believed now this was exactly the point. The moments that alter a life almost never announce themselves while they are happening. Then the lights dimmed. The screen behind me came alive with faces. A woman in her 40s spoke first, a former foster youth who said a scholarship from Rachel's foundation had made it possible for her to become a nurse. Then Harold appeared, older now, voice shaking as he talked about the paperwork I helped him untangle when he had nearly given up. A teacher I had not seen in 15 years spoke next. She talked about the granola bars I kept in my desk drawer and cried so openly that I had to put my hand over my mouth to keep from doing the same. Lena came last. Her daughter sat beside her. "She sat with us," Lena said simply. "That's all, she sat with us until it stopped feeling impossible." I looked into the audience and saw Gregory seated alone near the back, no crowd around him. No camera smile, no performance, just stillness. watching, the way I had once stood still under lights he controlled. After the event, once the room had begun to empty and the staff were clearing glasses and folding linen, he found me near the coat check. He didn't charm, he didn't posture. He didn't search for a clever line. I watched all of it, he said. The video, the stories, all of it. 27 years, Angela, and I never once asked where you went on Tuesday afternoons. His voice caught on Tuesday. I knew he was thinking about Diane. About all the absences he had never investigated because he had never cared enough to be curious. I'm sorry, he said. Not the kind of sorry that asks for something in return. Just sorry. I spent nearly 3 decades beside someone extraordinary and never bothered to look up long enough to understand who she was. The strangest part was that I believed him. After so many years, I could still tell the difference between a performance and a reckoning. This was the second. Thank you for saying that, I told him. I do forgive you, Gregory. I want you to know that, but forgiveness isn't the same thing as returning. He nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't ask me to reconsider. He simply stood there in his good suit, looking older than I had ever seen him, and accepted what was true. I left that gala by myself. The evening air was cool, the city quieter than it had any right to be after such a full night, and for the first time in years, walking alone did not feel like abandonment. It felt like ownership. Like the beginning of a life that finally belonged to me. The next 6 months changed everything, though not in dramatic bursts. Real transformation rarely arrives like that. It came the way most lasting things do, quietly, by accumulation. Under my leadership, Rachel's foundation expanded in ways I never would have imagined the first night I opened her envelope. We opened 2 additional shelters, including one in a rural town that had gone more than 10 years without emergency housing. The scholarship program she had started with only a handful of young people each year now supported 30, most of them teenagers aging out of foster care with nowhere stable to go. Lena completed her certification that spring and started at a pediatric clinic 3 weeks later. The first photo she sent me was of her name badge. Lena Brooks, RN. 3 exclamation marks beneath it and nothing more. I printed it and taped it inside my desk drawer, in the place where I used to keep granola bars for children I assumed would never remember me. I had something now that did not depend on anyone else's permission. Purpose, that was the word for it, not admiration, not status, not comfort purchased at the cost of self-erasure. Purpose. That spring Gregory stepped down as chairman. People who didn't know the whole story were surprised. I was. The board had not forced him out in the end. Public outrage had cooled somewhat by then, as it usually does. The numbers had steadied enough for him to remain if he insisted. But he told me over coffee one afternoon, one of our last conversations as anything still resembling husband and wife, that he did not want to spend the rest of his life being the man who only discovered decency after it cost him everything. He wanted to build something smaller, he said, something honest, something that belonged to the better version of himself he was still trying to become. We separated with far more grace than either of us had offered the marriage in its final years. No screaming in courtrooms, no turning property into weapons, no long war disguised as paperwork. Just 2 tired people sitting across from lawyers, signing documents, then standing at the end and shaking hands like colleagues closing out a long and complicated contract. Before I left the office for the last time as Gregory's wife, he asked one final question. Do you think we could have been happy if I had paid attention sooner? I told him the truth. I don't know. And I don't need to know anymore. That answer startled him more than anger would have. On a quiet Sunday in early autumn, Daniel and I drove out to visit Rachel's grave. Her headstone was modest. It sat beneath an oak tree just beginning to turn gold around the edges. Daniel brought white lilies, her favorite, and laid them carefully at the base of the stone. I gave him space for a moment. Then I knelt and placed my hand on the cool granite, tracing the letters of her name. You believed I saved your life, I said softly. But I've had months to think, and I'm not sure that's the whole truth. I think you gave mine back to me too. It only took 30 years for the circle to close. Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't need to say anything. He just rested a hand briefly on my shoulder, the way you do when what someone needs isn't comfort exactly, only witness. We stayed there in the quiet for a little while longer before turning toward the car. That was when I noticed her. A young woman, maybe 19 or 20, sitting alone on a bench just beyond the cemetery gates, a duffel bag at her feet. Arms folded tightly across herself, though the air wasn't cold enough to explain it. There was a particular stillness about her, not peace, fear. The careful stillness of someone trying not to be noticed, because being noticed has so often led to harm. I knew that stillness. I had seen it once before beneath a bus station awning in the rain. This time I didn't hesitate. I walked over, sat down on the far end of the bench, close enough to be there, far enough not to crowd her, and asked the only question that had ever really mattered in moments like that. "Would you like to sit with me for a while?" She looked at me, startled, guarded, then slowly something in her shoulders eased, just a little. Like someone finally setting down a weight they had expected to carry alone. She nodded. And the thing that had begun 30 years earlier, with a stranger, a frightened girl, and a cheap meal in a diner, began again the same way it always had. Quietly, without applause, without witnesses. Without anyone keeping score. People will laugh while deciding what you are worth. They will lift the microphone, name the price, and wait for the room to agree. But life keeps its own ledger. And long after the laughter dies and the ballroom empties, truth settles in. When it does, one thing becomes impossible to miss. Kindness has always been worth more than cruelty could ever afford.